Welcome back to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. Later this month, the Congress for the New Urbanism holds its annual summit in Providence, Rhode Island, a city that has embraced many of the group's principles like adaptive reuse, rerouting disruptive freeways, and compact, human-centered placemaking. It will be the 33rd convening and a homecoming of sorts, as the Congress held its big meeting there in 2006 and celebrated many new urbanist-inspired successes, including the reclamation of street space for pedestrians and bikes, and the daylighting of downtown rivers and the popular cultural event Waterfire. Well, for this episode of the Land Matters podcast, we are joined by Mallory Baches, the current president of the Congress for the New Urbanism. I'll be calling it CNU for short, by the way. She is in her second year of leading this very active organization of architects, planners, urban designers, developers, engineers, everyday citizens, and many others dedicated to promoting a livable and sustainable built environment. I'll post the full bio online, but even a short version reveals some impressive credentials in the field of city planning and urban design. She started out with a venerable new urbanist firm, Duany, Plater, Zyberk and Company. Of course, that's with Andres Duany, an early leader of the movement. And she continued her own urban design practice with both private and public clients, creating a greenfield and infill master plans, architectural and adaptive reuse concept designs, urban and architectural codes, and advised various communities on climate impacts. She holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame, Master of Science in Sustainable Urban Development from the University of Oxford, and was also a fellow at the University of Miami School of Architecture. She's accredited with the American Planning Association and U.S. Green Building Council and was named a member of the august ranks of the Next Urban Vanguard class by Next City. Mallory Baches, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
Anthony, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, CNU is now more than 3 decades old, so congratulations on that. But with that seasoned elder statesman status comes a question. What is CNU going to do now? What's it all about right now? What's it advocating for? How can the organization make a difference in today's political environment? And how can you stay relevant? I go back a ways with New Urbanism. As a journalist in the 90s, you started out being mostly an alternative to sprawl, and that caused quite a stir back in the 1990s. Is that still the central mission? And before you answer that, let me quote the preamble to the charter of the New Urbanism, which says, "The Congress for the New Urbanism views disinvestment in central cities, the spread of placeless sprawl, increasing separations by race and income, environmental deterioration, loss of agricultural lands and wilderness, and the erosion of society's built heritage as one interrelated community building challenge." So, is all that still true?
You know, I think it's a really fair question for any nonprofit. How do you stay relevant year after year? It's certainly one that I grappled with when I took this role. You were mentioning the 90s. That's when I was first learning architecture. I was learning design at Notre Dame, and I was doing so under faculty that had embraced these ideas of new urbanism. And then I obviously continued my learning working for Elizabeth Plater Zyberk and her husband, Andres Duany. And that was a time when innovation was happening in real time. That was when the Transect was first being explored. That was when the smart code was being created. And we were really pushing the boundaries of what form-based coding could do. Could it be a municipally applied approach to land use? And the idea of live work, this is the one I always think to myself. I remember trying to convince developers that people really did want to live and work in the same place as I now live and work in my home as a remote office that CNU is. It's not been that long since these were revolutionary ideas. So when I took the leadership of CNU, in some ways, it felt like a bit of a generational handoff. I had learned under the folks that founded this organization, and now it was time to try and lead the organization. So I think the quote from the preamble that you cited, it's as relevant today as it was when that document was first drafted, because that challenge still exists in cities and towns all across the country. And CNU has made important progress. Many more people see that in a related community building challenge than they did when we first started. Many more people want the alternative of great urbanism. And so many more people relate to this interrelated community building challenge than just in the general public than they did when we first started. But we also know a lot more of what stands in the way of achieving that vision. And so we know that regulations at every level of governance make it illegal to build some of the great urbanism that the general public wants. We know that the cost of great urbanism makes it increasingly inaccessible for members of the community. And we know that the impacts of the changing climate make much of the great urbanism that already exists vulnerable to the damage of extreme weather events or the inundation of waterways. And those three pillars of CNU's current strategic plan tell us where the organization needs to continue to make an impact to achieve the vision the charter describes.
So just to pick up on sprawl, it just feels like a little bit of a dated issue in terms of having a foil. Where does sprawl fit in on this? It sounds like you're just concentrating on cities and compact development and not so much focusing on the foil or the bad phenomenon of sprawl.
Yeah, I think the idea of new urbanism being anti-sprawl is still sort of the simplest way to describe what we're working on. The way I think about it in terms of trying to contextualize where our organization is, where our members are working, I think about the fact that when the original founding generation of this movement was first trying to describe what they were working to achieve, every system that impacted the built environment was an obstacle. The enemy was everywhere. Every single thing that you had to consider when trying to create walkable urbanism was something you had to overcome, whether that was a regulation, whether that was a building practice, whether that was knowledge, whether that was understanding of level of service versus walkable safety, pedestrian safety. There were so many influences reiterating sprawl is the necessary outcome of any sort of development.
Like the street had to be so wide,
right.
the lot had to be so large, whatever it was.
Exactly. So in some respects, it was an easier time to make the argument for reform because every single system needed reform. Now, 33 years later, we're at a stage where we have lots of allies in this fight that we didn't have when we started. And that's both the good news and it sort of daylights the challenge that even with 33 years of influence on attempting to reverse unmitigated sprawl, there is still unmitigated sprawl happening all over the country. And even in places that, I think there's a presumption that when you think about sprawl, it's like, oh, it's the exurbs, the edges of development. But the conditions that reiterate car dependency and reiterate some of the challenges that we're talking about in terms of the impact of the climate, in terms of affordability, in terms of the well-being of communities, the pattern that produces sprawl and whatever industries are reinforcing that, those are still industries that need reform. Those are still places where the status quo has to change.
You mentioned some new allies, perhaps new constituencies.
Yeah.
You mean like retiring boomers? Who else?
That's right. I often think to myself, when I was first understanding these ideas in the 90s, I was a young person who would watch the TV show Friends and think, oh, the only place in the world that I want to move to is New York City, because this lifestyle that's being depicted on this television show seems like really accessible to me, really something appealing to me. And I recall that my parents were sort of like, we lived in the city for a while and then we decided that we would, move out to the suburbs. You'll change your tune. And that was very much the common narrative. And I think you point out those same parents are moving back into cities. And meanwhile, many of their children's generation has never left the cities. And then likewise, even if they did, their children, that's my child's age, are aiming for living in cities and towns and really enjoying the benefits of urbanism. And I think that's a big part of, on a national scale, what I'm talking about when I think about, the success that we've had. But I also think that an important additional level to that are the disciplines, the professional cohorts that have influence on the built environment that might not have thought so much of the new urbanism as something that had to do with them in 1996 when the charter was signed. Or if they did, it was a rare person participating in that industry. Transportation engineering is sort of the key category for me that comes to mind, because originally when we're talking about a variety of housing types, that doesn't necessarily immediately link you to the fact that streets need to be designed differently in order to accommodate those variety of housing types. And yet that's true. And so in the course of explaining this vision that new urbanists have worked on these past 33 years, that what we have managed to do is bring on more compatriots in the reality that so much of the business as usual and whatever that industry is, whatever that discipline is inhibiting what everyone might look at and see as a totally viable way to live. The folks in New York City and all the way down on the intensity scale to small towns. I've lived in a small town for quite a long time over the course of my life, and it was still a town with walkable urbanism where, you could access your daily needs and you had community spaces and the public realm was enjoyable and reinforcing for community building.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, in terms of smart growth and new urbanism, you've kind of won. You've won over a lot of people.
People tell us that. And then I think, boy, there's still a lot of work to do.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to add a historical note. It's somewhat fanciful, but I've always been interested to know that the Congress for the New Urbanism, the reason it's called a Congress in part is that it's based on CIM, the Congress International d'Architecture Moderne, forgive my French, very successfully advocated for the modernist project of the 20th century. And then they essentially voted themselves out of business, which I've always thought was kind of cool. I doubt you would call for the dissolution of your organization on the eve of your summit, but what do you think about that idea as you think about how an organization evolves over 3 decades?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it perhaps won't surprise you knowing the enjoyment of debate and rhetoric that our movement has, and that especially the founders of the movement, who were definitely making a referential towards Siam. The nomenclature was intentional, calling our event, our annual family reunion, a Congress. But the thing I think about when I look at that historical model is that the model was one where the participants were very intentionally and strategically gathering to advance their work. They were learning from each other. They were developing their own practice or reflecting on their own practice in response to what their compatriots were doing, what their fellow attendees were doing. It was a learning experience with the goal of supporting and mutually encouraging each other to improve. And at CNU 33, whether the attendees know the history of Siam or not, they're going to be participating in that same type of engagement, that same practice of critique and debate and idea development and collaboration and advancing of these ideas in the real world. And I think that's sort of the historical lesson that I like to take away. And so long as we're continuing to successfully do that as an organization to support that kind of experience, there's a role for CNU in this world.
Well, let's stay in the current moment for a bit because, well, it's just the reality that we're all in. Retrenchment at the federal level. I think that's the best neutral term for it. Reducing funding for housing, undoing environmental regulations, repealing the Inflation Reduction Act for clean energy manufacturing projects in legacy cities. And also, interestingly, a related phenomenon that we've seen, which is state governments taking action to rein in local jurisdictions on things like complete streets initiatives. So there's a lot of reversal of a lot of policies on its face, less funding and support generally for cities. What are you doing in response? What kinds of things can you focus on to stay relevant, and how can you best support cities and towns in this current time?
Well, I'm going to start in my answer by reflecting on the fact that a core strength of CNU is that we're a membership-based nonprofit. Our movement represents practitioners, like you've said before, from all of these different roles in impacting cities and towns. I was an urban designer. We have transportation planners, real estate developers, policy writers, elected officials. we're battling some of those battles, in real time. And analysts and researchers too, we're understanding what the implications of some of these decisions mean for cities and towns, for the communities that they're responsible for. And so that work directly affects communities. It's directly informed by communities at the local level. And so that constant learning, like I've already addressed, is the context of all of these practices is the landscape in which we then learn from each other and adapt our approach accordingly. And so, yeah, these are drastic shifts, especially at the federal policy and funding level, but also, like you say, in some state conditions as well. When I look at that, I just remind myself that over 3 decades, CNU has seen changes in rhetoric and in leadership, in priorities, in the market, in the economic conditions of where we are doing this work. I remember the Great Recession. I was attempting to continue my practice during that era, and it required a lot of adaptation to better understand how to do the kind of work that I knew was needed in an environment where the old systems that I had become comfortable with and familiar with had broken down. I'm not saying that's easy. What I am saying is I recognize that what has remained consistent is this vision. CNU has never apologized for the charter. It describes what we deeply believe is fundamentally supportive for the well-being of the majority of folks. And some people are going to see the current political climate, as it were, and say it's a time to rethink. And I think that's a valid position. But what I don't want to lose sight of is rethinking our strategy is responsible and, necessary. Rethinking what we believe in is not on the table. We know what we're aiming towards. We may have to adapt how we get towards that. And the fact of the matter is, any sort of binary view of conservative or liberal or red state or blue state is a vast simplification of what it looks like to try and achieve this vision in any given community. CNU has always been a national organization. We've always had folks coming in from their work in communities where it's a growth region, and also folks coming in from communities where it's a region that's struggling with decline and trying to figure out how to adapt accordingly. We've had folks coming in from areas where there's a real political support for growth or a real political support for individual land rights or for large-scale development, and then folks are in the exact opposite camp in their practice. And what our work as an organization has to do is remember the fundamental principles of what make good walkable urbanism, and then support all of our members in all of the conditions where they're attempting to do that work, and learn from what they're experiencing on the ground and play our part in helping them create more of exactly what our charter describes.
You've also attracted support over time from conservatives, somewhat similar to Jane Jacobs, actually, work the same way, particularly when you talk about barriers and regulations. One other topic, though, it really struck me. You just came out with your report on several projects across the U.S. to dismantle and reconfigure freeways. Those freeways that blast through urban neighborhoods, a product of the era of urban renewal, mostly in the 50s and 60s. I think it's safe to say that endeavor is quite out of favor right now. Pete Buttigieg, we hardly knew ye. The Trump administration has moved to freeze or claw back or redirect funding for freeway removal. It's being characterized as woke or addressing social justice or environmental justice aims. Given all that, how do you proceed from here on dismantling freeways as an important part of the organization's portfolio?
That's a biannual report. So the jury met to review the campaigns for this year back in the fall before we knew what the November election results would be. It certainly is quite a time to be releasing that 9th edition of the report, the Freeways Without Futures report. And when we did the release, we included an introductory letter from me sort of acknowledging that this is a time where the landscape of our work has changed in the midst of us doing the work. And so at the very least, we can recognize that the system for realizing these goals of these grassroots campaigns, that system is no longer predictable in the way that it was, say, 2 years ago. And so all of this is evolutionary in form in one way or another. And I think this current moment, it would be absolutely naive for me and for CNU overall, the New Urbanism overall, to imagine that we'll just continue on pushing in the exact same way. But that being said, the 9th edition of this report had already triggered for me as president of CNU and for our staff and our board a welcome time to revisit that program anyway. It's time to up the scale. It's time to find new ways to support the communities and their campaigning efforts at the local level. And the overall program that Freeways Without Futures, that report is produced within the Highways to Boulevards program, is one that crosses the scale of who the jurisdiction over a particular roadway might be and really gets at the heart of the fact that if we are creating space solely for cars in our most valuable, most precious urban conditions, we're necessarily walking away from all of the benefits that urbanism can offer. Those are economic, yes, and they're also social, and they're cultural, and they're environmental too. And the organization at this stage of the game is committed to providing leadership with that shift in how we support communities in this fight. We have to maintain the momentum that we've created, but we have to do so in new ways. We're working on a publication that will be a handbook for helping communities at the local level transform their highway conditions into boulevards, but otherwise into walkable, bikeable transportation, transit supportive infrastructure. And we're gathering thought leaders to re-envision the Freeways Without Futures approach to helping these local campaigns advocate for their needs. The ways that that will change over the next 2 years remain to be seen, but that will be coming from the experts across the country that have been supporting these campaigns with technical assistance, have been advocating for systemic change in their local policy, state policy, and federal policy. Local campaigners have learned so much more about the health harms that these freeways cause, the environmental deterioration that happens because of the runoff from these freeways, the communities that have been lost through the construction of these freeways during urban renewal, the history of those communities, the economic losses that that destruction represented for the communities. And so that's the sort of understanding that we're now bringing to the table, and we're ripe to be able to find better ways to create an impact through these campaigns and to create the resources and the toolkits and the assistance needed to do so.
Can they do it without federal funding, though?
Well, one would say that if the Federal Department of Transportation controls a roadway, that they are going to have the final say on what happens to that roadway. That is not to say that there isn't very valid critique of the existence of those roadways that very plausibly could appeal to any political climate. We just have to make that critique well known.
Okay, switching gears, one of the things CNU has done so much work on is something that makes some people's eyes glaze over, not mine, mind you, but that's zoning, land use regulations, and codes. So are you satisfied with how new urbanists have supported efforts in statewide zoning reform? Basically, this idea of upzoning inappropriate locations to allow more housing to be built. And by the way, that, of course, that's been another area where there has been some pushback. But are you a big believer in this effort to reduce regulatory barriers to increase the supply of housing?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of things that I think I'd like to touch on here. The first that I'll start with is I think it's important to remember that affordable housing and affordable urbanism are not the same thing. Our friends at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, their Housing and Transportation Affordability Index that they've created a couple decades ago now, that's a tool that's been pointing out this fact for quite a long time. So yes, Increasing housing supply is fundamental to addressing affordability. There needs to be enough supply for the number of people who need a home. That's a basic premise. And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact when making the argument for that premise that the spatial conditions of that housing inform a host of things that influence the affordability of life for those residents. And that's where I think, at the risk of sounding like I'm adding nuance, I think that's really fundamental. And it is a reflection of what we're advocating for here as an organization and as a movement. So that's sort of the first piece that I'd like to hit on. But the second then is that supporting state regulatory reform to allow more housing, to allow a diverse variety of housing types, to build more in more places that already have housing but need more options or need more housing itself. That's a central element of how CNU supports affordable housing and has from the very beginning of the movement. You can't reduce transportation costs by reducing car dependence if you are not allowing more dense housing development to occur in ways that support public transit investments. Cities across the country are working to juggle that balance for themselves. They have a demand for better transportation options. They may not currently have the housing and the intensity of urbanism that can reinforce that transit that is being asked for. We were just in Cincinnati last year for the Congress, and the city, while we were there, passed their Connected Communities initiative, which was to tie zoning reform directly with transportation investments, with transit investments, so that they could ensure that if they're going to invest in this transportation system, that they're doing so in places where the population can support those investments. You can't increase housing supply within existing urbanism, but then neglect to create safe and reliable transportation. It's sort of the flip of that coin, right? And so reducing the number of cars on the street and the amount of land needed to store those cars wherever they go and whatever they're doing, you need to reduce that demand in order to create the intensity of urbanism that then can reinforce the transportation investment in the first place. These are all intricately tied. And in many states, the enabling legislation, it is in one way or another inhibiting local municipalities from being able to reach these goals, even if they want to, even if they have the support of the community, they have the political will to be able to make these changes to their existing communities, their existing neighborhoods. They oftentimes are running up against state requirements or state legislation that inhibits their ability to do so. And so better supporting the local municipalities with their own advocacy at the state level for what they need to be able to achieve these goals of supporting walkability, supporting a variety of housing options, supporting the systems that will then support their economic growth and economic development. These are the sorts of advocacy opportunities that CNU has. And yes, some of those are tied directly to just, the most fundamental aspects of zoning reform, but they start to get into many other aspects of what states may be wanting their municipalities to encourage. You aren't really going to find a state that says, you know what, we'd like you to not improve your economic contributions here. Well, that gets tied to a lot of these other systems. And that economic development can be improved by improving the regulatory conditions in the individual cities to support better urbanism.
So it sounds like a little bit more of an emphasis on implementation once there is consensus in a given community or state.
Oh, absolutely. And I also think what we were talking about earlier about there being much more of a demand for good quality urban conditions. There's much more of a demand from the market to be able to have that choice. And so municipalities know that. And one of the areas within CNU's membership, one of the categories that we've seen the largest growth trajectory has been local government, whether it's elected officials, whether it's staff members of local municipalities. There was a time in the movement where that was not the case, that there were so many folks working in the actual machinations of governance that were really buying into a broader philosophical approach to doing so. And I'm thrilled to see these friends in local government that are coming to the table and talking about how the designs that they might want to see approved are running up against roadblocks and they need help in overcoming those roadblocks. They want to facilitate these better developments, these better designs, these better outcomes, and they need help in getting there. And they're wonderful partners at the table for CNU and are then the best advocates for what their state might change in order to be able to support their efforts.
Finally, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the issue of form or style. New urbanism has been very strongly associated with a neo-traditional approach, sort of a back to the future notion of embracing the urban form and to some extent the architecture that was in place generally before World War I. And of course, it's always been in stark contrast to some of the designs and configurations of 20th century modernism. But there's always been a little bit of an idea of nostalgia associated with new urbanism. Now, David Broussat, then architecture critic for the Providence Journal, wrote in 2006, when you were last in Providence, the new urbanism seeks to reconstitute the traditional patterns of living that have been overturned by modern planning and design. Traditional styles are not necessarily the key to traditional neighborhood development. Walkability, proximity to shopping, and intimacy of scale are more important. So those are complex thoughts to hold in one's head at the same time. And perhaps it's on a superficial level. I think most people look at successful places like Seaside or Kentlands, and they do see some white picket fences. Where do you come down on that? Is there any new urbanist project or development you can point to that is a more contemporary design, or does it not matter?
Well, that's a loaded question asking someone who has an architecture degree. We always have an opinion about architecture, right? So I always sort of enjoy the topic of addressing style because it is often brought up without the context of the rest of what new development looks like. And I think that that's an important pause to think about what you see in any given community and what the sort of architectural stylistic expression might be. So when you visit Seaside or Kentlands or the neighborhood I lived in for 15 years, an urbanist greenfield project called Haversham outside Beaufort, South Carolina, the buildings have very familiar architectural traditions to their surroundings. That's also the case of pretty much every other housing development nearby these particular projects. And even much of the commercial development that's nearby these particular projects. I think about new urbanist principles being about the holistic view of what development should look like, and that those are what sets a Seaside or a Kentlands or a Haversham or any other of these much more traditional architecturally stylistic projects apart compared to their peers. The walkability and the mix of uses and the quality of the public realm and the prioritization of human beings over personal vehicles. The architecture is sort of a matter of taste of the market at that point. So, I can speak to Haversham, and it's outside of Beaufort, South Carolina, over 300-year-old colonial era founded city. And pretty much every new house that gets built has some level of what someone might describe as traditional architectural detailing. And that's very much reflective of what the market coming to that community and wanting to live in a home there is demanding. That isn't something that has to be prescriptive, that it somehow deeply reinforces all of these other aspects of quality of urbanism that I've listed out. And sometimes there are places where that matter of taste is going to lean more towards a contemporary expression. And I anecdotally would say those tend to happen more often in higher density developments where the importance of highly detailed architectural elements might not be as demanding, and or the building materials for the type of building, the scale of building might not reflect that. And at the end of the day, we're still talking about walkability. We're still talking about mix of uses. We're still talking about the quality of life that the development imparts. I think that the distinction there has much more to do with what the community finds appealing, what the potential participants in this new development, whether they're business owners, whether they're residents, what they're going to feel compelled to live and work and be in community within architecturally.
Well, it's some pretty good logic. I mean, if it's what people want and it works, then so be it. I ask in part because I just happen to be working on a Bloomberg City Lab piece, including an interview with Carl Elefante, who will be at CNU. He's the author of Going for Zero. We take a look at how much the design professions are engaged in retrofits and reusing existing buildings. They're not coming up with funky new forms. They're retooling older buildings. So a big project might involve converting a 1920s downtown office building to residential. That's just very different from Frank Gehry or Rem Koolhaas coming out with a shiny object.
Yeah, for sure. I'll pivot only slightly to say that if every building is a so-called fabric building, then you do lose the value of those sort of monumental civic elements that orient you within the city or mark particular historic moments or particular activities that are of significance to the community. And from my very earliest days of designing new urbanist projects, we always left the civic buildings, as it were, uncoded because these are expressions of what the community sees of themselves. And while, there may be some sort of consistent standard of what might be seen as at least partially stylistic in nature that you're trying to achieve with a particular project, the compact pattern of historic urban fabric, it provides the most efficiencies for the broadest number of needs of any land use approach.
What a great way to conclude. Mallory Baches, president of the Congress for the New Urbanism, thank you for this great conversation.
Thank you, Anthony.
Well, the big summit is happening in Providence, June 11th to the 14th. The website for the Congress for the New Urbanism is cnu.org. The Lincoln Institute, of course, is interested in many issues that have alignment here, whether zoning reform or affordable housing or the importance of design in creating infill density. Our website can be found at lincolninst.edu. While you're there, scroll to the bottom and join our mailing list to get periodic updates on our work. Also on social media, the handle is @LandPolicy. Finally, don't forget to rate, share, and subscribe to the Land Matters podcast. For now, I'm Anthony Flint, signing off until next time.